All right, welcome everyone to the second Dean's Huddle of our third season. And this is actually really a Dean's Huddle because there's two of us here. And we're very pleased to welcome Jason Harkins to join us tonight to talk a lot about entrepreneurship.
Yep.
He is a dean as well and has a day-to-day job as the executive dean of the Maine Business School. And we can talk a little bit about that, but I think mostly what we want to talk today about is his expertise, vast in entrepreneurship. He works with a lot of organizations in Maine, sits on some boards, has a vast background, has studied the topic, and really is our resident entrepreneurship professor. I know he'd like to have some other colleagues, but he's really our main one. So Jason, why don't you kick off the huddle, say hi to a few of our students, and introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. I'm thrilled to be here and share a little bit about the things that I've learned over the course of my time in Maine and working in entrepreneurship. As Norm said, I am associate professor of entrepreneurship. I have not only been an academic studying entrepreneurship, but I have also run an accelerator called Scratchpad Accelerator. I've opened a co-working space. I sit on multiple boards of actual startups as well as organizations that promote startup activity throughout the state of Maine, and I'm thrilled to be here talking to you today about entrepreneurship.
That's great. Well, welcome, Jason. And Jason holds, as you'd expect, someone of his level. He's got an MBA from the University of Missouri, make sure I get this right, and a PhD from the University of Oklahoma, not Oklahoma State, which is the Price School, so very well trained. Well, I think I made that mistake last time when we did it. I had the wrong Oklahoma. So very well trained from great schools. So let's start off and talk a bit about the Scratchpad Accelerator.
Yeah.
This is something that you had some big grants from both industry and public. And what was the purpose? What were you doing? How did it help Maine businesses? How did it help entrepreneurs? Tell us a bit about that concept.
Sure. So it started in 2015. We were motivated by all of the work that we'd been seeing happen in Colorado and Silicon Valley and Boston with all these incredible accelerators that are supporting scalable companies that are trying to get ready to go raise money and really get to scale. And what we were finding is that there were a variety of programs to help them start their businesses in the state of Maine. But to scale those businesses, they kind of fell off a cliff in terms of the support. And so we built Scratchpad Accelerator as a seed accelerator oriented towards helping those companies get to scale. We ran 3 cohorts over the course of about 4.5 years. Took a break during COVID because I didn't know how to do that thing remotely, but we're actually bringing it back. We'll have our next cohort in spring of 2024 and then expect another cohort in 2025.
Wonderful. It sounds great. And so you think that the Scratchpad Accelerator has had an impact on the state and businesses, and some success stories in there you can talk about?
Absolutely. So what we say when we talk to both our government partners as well as industry partners is we estimate the impact of the accelerator to be the increase in revenue of several $1 million across the companies that have participated.
Wonderful.
We have had dozens of employees, venture capital commitments in excess of $5 million to those companies. So some really incredible opportunities. And I would say out of our companies that have participated in Scratchpad, about half of them are in business, which doesn't sound great until you compare us to like a Techstars or a Y Combinator where only 10% of their companies are still in business within a couple of years of graduation. So we've tried to be really selective and we've been really fortunate. Maine is an amazing place to start a startup.
Wonderful. I've actually read some data recently, you probably have better data than I do, that 1 in 3,000 companies in the United States that actually get to the place of developing a business plan actually become profitable. So it sounds like you're batting really, really well in terms of your baseball players. So,
yeah, I mean, it's incredible how challenging, especially when you're starting a startup, it is to get to the point where you're generating enough revenue to build headcount and to really grow into the market.
Wonderful. So the next question is a 2-part question.
Sure.
And so as you know, our audience are people look like our ages, like we know the MBA students. A few of them might want, so the first part is might be thinking about at some point starting their own thing or their own business. Give them a bit of advice, like if you're coming out of an MBA, you're working professionals. But the bigger one, the second one will be mostly people that are working for or going to work for someone like you or an entrepreneur that wants to start something.
Right.
How do you, a founder, a creator, and you're thinking about being a COO or a CEO or a VP.
Right.
So talk to those, give some advice on how to, those pathways, starting your own thing or working for someone who's kind of started their own thing.
So if you're starting your own thing, I would say there's three major things that I would say to anybody who's interested in it. Number one is the most important determinant of long-term success is finding what we call product market fit. You're going to build something, it's a good or a service or whatever. You have to find a market that is willing to pay you more than it costs you to produce it. And that product market fit process actually takes a really long time. And starting by talking to your customers as early, or your potential customers as early in the journey as possible, will make a huge difference in making sure you don't make bad bets because you weren't paying attention. The second thing that I would say is stay nimble. We know that innovation is essentially iterating at scale, right? So the more experiments and iterations you can deliver, the more quickly, the more likely you are to stay ahead of your competition. And then the third thing, and this is always true if you're starting a company, is hire slow and fire fast, because talent is the name of the game in startup land. And if you're going to compete on world-class talent, you've got to make sure that you're bringing them on and being really selective. And if they're not the right person, you have to get them out or they can kill your whole company.
3 great takeaways there. That was really good.
Thank you. If you are going to work for a startup as an MBA, particularly if you're coming out of a corporate world, you have to realize that the world of startup land is super different, especially if you're joining before a company is 50 or 100 people. There's not going to be a lot of standard operating procedures and processes, and things are going to be fluid, and they're going to be flexible, and they're going to be messy. They're going to give you an opportunity to do the most amazingly meaningful things, but you can't expect to have a procedure and a policy and a budget and a organizational chart for everything. A lot of it is just being assembled as the plane is being flown, so to speak.
Oh, that's great. That's great. One thing that if someone looks at your background and your resume and your bio online is you're very involved with boards, both for-profit, not-for-profit, and kind of entrepreneurial advisory groups. So tell us first a little bit about what's that involved? How do those all different? What's your kind of role? But also then maybe extend that and say, hey, if you're, like all of our students are ambitious people that want to move up, how might you use a volunteer experience, or some of these I'm guessing are more involved than that, to leverage your career or forward your path? So tell us a little bit what that is, and then is this something that some MBAs could think about doing themselves?
Yeah, personally, I believe that board service has innumerable benefits to people who participate in them, especially volunteer boards. People who serve on volunteer boards are super passionate about the thing that they're giving their time to. And when you step up and you join them, you create an immediate opportunity for you to have a shared interest, a shared experience that can turn into a network or a potential future job or a connection where somebody can see the quality of your work in a context where they're not necessarily hiring you. The nonprofit boards that I serve on tend to be what we would call ecosystem organizations. So these are groups that are trying to figure out how do we support more activity across the entrepreneurial landscape by supporting more programs that do the work with entrepreneurs.
So you're not dedicated to a specific company, it's more of...
Right, so you're part of the organization bringing together the umbrella of other organizations that are doing individual work. The most common complaint we hear in the entrepreneurial landscape is, where do I go next? Right. How do I figure out who's going to best be able to help me? Because being a startup founder is really hard. And so those ecosystem organizations try and do a lot of that work. So that's what I would say on the nonprofit board side. In terms of getting engaged in a startup board, that is board work like you won't do anywhere else, because you will be relied on deeply for your expertise. In the best cases, you get a little bit of stock grant in exchange for your time. The company cashes out. You make a little bit of money. maybe if you get lucky, you make a lot of money, but you're going to be called into active participation alongside a CEO founder who is building a thing that doesn't exist. And so that's something you want to make sure that you can really dedicate your time and energy and expertise to, because there are many board calls I've been on that start at 9 p.m. and end at 11:30 p.m. because, oh my gosh, X, Y, and Z happened with our funding or with our major customer, or what do I do about this? And it's not something that you get to schedule in for 3 weeks from now.
Right. Well, that's great. I mean, a couple of points there that are interesting. So one, you talked about the startup founder being really hard,
yeah.
right? And thinking about the students and the MBA students, what they might think about this. And I even was reflecting as you're talking on my own experience. I've talked about this before. Mm-hmm. I was involved with some startups when I was finishing my MBA, and in all cases they kind of pittered out, and really it was because we all went and got full-time jobs.
Right.
And so this notion of, who is an entrepreneur? So helping people look in the mirror and think, do I really? I think we all like to think I could go be, Bill Gates or whatever, but really most of us can't. Like, we don't have that, or maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but do we have that? We think we can, but then when push comes to shove and risk comes to reward and families come to this, we're better off like a minority partner or a supporter.
Right.
How does someone really go through that process, or how do you know who's an entrepreneur? Or flip it to the other side, as you talked about these groups that are investing and supporting the ecosystem like you've done. How do you know that Norm is a good choice? You know what, Norm is probably better working for that entrepreneur, and Susan, she's got what it takes to start something. How do you rationalize all that?
I mean, when I work with prospective entrepreneurs, I ask a lot of questions like what you were just asking. It really comes down to a lot of where is the individual, what is their own orientation and aspiration and willingness to deal with the ambiguity and uncertainty that does exist around developing an organization. I was listening to a podcast this morning, and I loved the way with a founder. I love the way he talked about it. He said one of the key determinants of being a successful startup founder is your willingness and ability to manifest a future, because there will be dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times in any startup where you are days, weeks, minutes from death. And you have to not just say, well, we could get out of this. You have to manifest and believe we will get out of this. It doesn't mean that you will necessarily be right. But if you don't believe it, then your team isn't going to believe it. And once people start saying, well, it's getting a little tough, I'm going to go check the job market. Oh, my LinkedIn's blowing up. Like, you lose the team, you lose the company. And so a lot of it, I mean, what we know about the differences between managers and entrepreneurs are they have really strong locus of control, meaning that they believe they can impact outcomes. They have a risk tolerance. It's not necessarily that they're risk seeking, but they have a risk tolerance. And generally speaking, they're willing to go above and beyond and believe that I can manifest, I can change the outcomes of things when I put everything into it. So we see a lot of that.
That's right. And this may be hard. Any tips when you're looking at those ecosystem ones you talked about?
Yeah.
And you see a set of people, maybe you're able to help fund 3 of them.
Right.
Any little tips on how you can see who is that person that will not pull the parachute, so to speak, and will go all in? Do you have any, or is that just really?
I mean, that's a great question. I think what I have tended to do historically as I've engaged in that work is to engage in really deep and intentional interviewing in a lot of different contexts. There are some assessments you can have people take that give you some insights into little pieces of it, but the holistic picture comes down, I think, to a certain amount of intuition in my experience. Because there are people that I could have sworn would have stuck with it or would have been entrepreneurs, and they decided not to do it. And there are people that I could have sworn would have gone the other way. So I think there's a certain amount of intuition there. But in my opinion, investing in people is always, there's always a good return on investment in that, even if they walk away from the startup. Just like serving on a nonprofit board, you have worked hard to help somebody achieve something they care deeply about. And, who knows where it's going to come back around to you, but I believe that if you do enough of that, it'll all come back around.
Yes, you hear that. You get that on your resume. That experience both is good for your resume,
Yeah.
but also good for your experience.
Absolutely.
Well, we're almost at time. This has been great. So just maybe a couple last things. One would be if there's anything else about entrepreneurship you'd like to share with the students you think we may have missed, or you'd like to highlight a point, go with that.
Right.
And if not, just some final words of advice for the MBA students. This stage, I mean, most are working,
Right.
about to add this credential.
Right.
From your experiences, what would you some
Right.
parting words for our audience?
Okay, so I'll start with the MBA one. You don't have to jump all in. Almost all startups start with what we would call kind of an element of a side hustle, where you can do a lot of work that are small commitments that create real options for the future, but in terms of what they're asking you to do today, it's not quit your job, second mortgage on the house, let's go start the thing, we haven't even talked to a customer. That's the wrong way to do it. Start with lots of little things, lots of little tests, lots of iterations, and make the commitment once you're confident that there's something to commit in. Doesn't mean you'll be successful, but you can de-risk it a little bit before you make that commitment. The other thing I would say, and I hear this all the time, Maine is an amazing place to start a startup. The ecosystem here is so accessible. It is so diverse. There is so much energy around supporting entrepreneurship in the state of Maine. If you're not in Maine, move to Maine and start your startup, because you can get to anyone here. And that is incredibly powerful and profound when we have entrepreneurs who have started here, who have left here to go to bigger startup communities. They have always said, man, that was so much harder. I couldn't get to talk to X, or I couldn't get access to Y resource. And so Maine is an amazing place to do the thing. And if you reach out to me or anybody else in the ecosystem, they can connect you to literally anybody that you need to talk to.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. Well, this was awesome, as we expected. So thank you, Dean Harkins, for joining us today. And he's certainly readily available to all of you, and you'll cross paths with him again. So enjoy your week, and thank you for joining us on the Dean's Huddle.
Thanks.